Okay, in case you don't know me, my name is Clark Muir, and I am the chair of the History Committee. So the next question is, why are we doing this? There was some discussion over this summer that we ought to do a series of webinars based on the Canadian astronomy history, and in doing so, we showcase our archival holdings. It is within the committee's mandate. It states that it is to promote and encourage the study and awareness of the history of astronomy in Canada. So that's what we're trying to do here. So this is the first of our History Committee sponsored webinars. The objective might be to do this on a regular frequency, perhaps as often as once a month. It is also designed, these talks, to allow others to contribute with opinions, comments, and questions. Also, I have scheduled this webinar for about 90 minutes, and I intend it to be a little shorter than that, but just with the first one, with hiccups like this, for example, I thought I would try for an hour and a half. So the first topic was fairly easy to decide. As all of you know, Mars is currently at a very favorable opposition. And so Randall Rosenfeld, who is still the RASC archivist and is vice chair of this committee, he will discuss the topic Mars through the eyes of the RASC, the visual evidence from our past oppositions.
Thanks, Clark. Oh, and the one thing I should point out is I am officially an artifact.
Oh. What, the hedgehog?
No, me. Okay. Let's see if this works. It seems to work. Terrific. So, Mars through the eyes of the RASC, the visual evidence from past oppositions. We're going to survey what survives in our archives in the way of observational drawings. That's what we're going to do. Now, it's just a survey. So, first thing I'm going to do is thank everyone for taking the time tonight to show up to this. It's very good of you. And I suppose this is sort of historic. This is the first, as Clark said, this is the first of these sessions. So, let's see here. There we go. Mars is topical, as Clark mentioned. And what the things we're going to look at today are, this is based on these images, is the instruments and the media used to record Mars, and some of the non-observational factors which might have affected the way people drew what they saw at the eyepiece, and what other observers in other organizations similar to the RASC were doing at the time. And finally, though I didn't get around to this, I don't have a slide, but we can still discuss this. How does our perspective on what our predecessors did, how they drew Mars, affect how we think how we draw Mars is going to look, say, a century from now? Sort of an interesting question. So, the RASC and Mars, good place to start. At the very first real meeting of the Toronto Astronomical Club, so that's the group that became the RASC, it's recorded in the minutes that Mr. Elvins produced a drawing of the appearance of Mars as observed by him on December the 29th, 1868. So the very first meeting, observational report, Mars comes up. I mean, that sort of makes sense. There's a suitable object for group observing, and from 1890, we have this recorded, that the earlier part of the evening was spent in observing the Moon, Jupiter, and Mars with portable telescopes provided for the purpose. The air being steady and very clear, some excellent views were obtained. I'm sure they were. Developments in the wider astronomical world about Mars were also reported on by various RASC members. Here's a quote. Mr. Larrett W. Smith, QC, DCL, Vice President, in the chair. Mr. Andrew Elvins, it's Elvins again, he'll come up again as we go through the night. So, Mr. A. Elvins called attention to the announced fact that the doubling of some of the lines on Mars, known as Schiaparelli's canals, had been observed at the Lick and Arequipa observatories during the favorable oppositions of the planet in August. It's like the latest stuff on the press is actually being reported at RASC meetings. And the society members, some society members even published observing advice. And here's one from Andrew Miller. This is actually the earliest example of a RASC publication on how to observe Mars. Because of its position in our solar system, and still more because of its resemblance to the Earth, Mars is admitted by most astronomers to be more worthy of careful study than perhaps any other member of the Sun's family. There is, however, no reason why the owner of any good telescope of 3 inches aperture or upward, or even a smaller one, if of fine quality, should not turn it to account for Martian study. And if he will but do so diligently, frequently, and carefully, he will soon find the work deeply interesting. So, clearly there's interest. And the RASC at the time is a microcosm of amateur, professional, and popular curiosity about Mars in general. I'm just going to go up. So that quote from Miller about using an instrument smaller than a 3-inch instrument, there are some examples done by RASC members today using telescopes of, say, only 2 inches aperture, so 60 millimeters, 50 to 60 millimeters. And it's amazing how much detail they saw. I think Eric in Calgary did some sketches, and Chris as well. And just, I was amazed by the detail that they could see. Now, problem with what we've got in the archives. There's less there than you might hope or expect. Survival depends on foresight of past and present members, the care they take, and a lot of luck. I'd almost say that luck is one of the key factors determining whether something survives or not. We only have drawings from 4 oppositions during the life of the RASC. I can extend that to 5, actually, if I sort of push it. So 1884, 1892, 1918, 1958, and 1960 are the historical ones. And from this diagram, you can see that the one in 1892, Mars is actually closest and largest to the Earth. We'll go on. So let's start at 1884. The reason this one is in brackets is because from 1869 to about 1890, the RASC had a shadowy, non-official existence, and it was revived officially in 1890. So this 1884 is just 6 years before that. The man who did this drawing, and there he is, Alan Miller, became one of the charter members of the RASC. And we're just lucky this drawing survives. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to run through the drawings from the various opposition, and then we're going to go back to them and look at them in greater detail. And when we do that, Chris can tell me why my interpretation of these things is wrong. So, Alan Miller lived a good long time for the period. He was a hospital administrator. That's what he did for a living. But he's a very determined and pretty good amateur astronomer. He's a friend of George Ellery Hale. So that's the guy who founded Yerkes Observatory and was responsible for Palomar being set up. He was a friend of his, well, a correspondent, and Miller got invited to be an early member of the International Astronomical Union. And that's pretty good for an amateur. He had his own observatory in his backyard in downtown Toronto, equipped with, everything was in a nice dome. He had a 4-inch refractor by Ray. It was a London maker. This is a picture of the instrument. This is when it was in Victoria, owned by someone else, so that's later. And speaking of media, this is on paper. This is pencil and watercolor, is what you're looking at. So, 1882. The society has been established for 2 years. The most productive astro-sketcher of that period, whose stuff survives that we still have, is Andrew Elvins. He's an interesting character. He was a tailor, so he was a blue collar worker. He was a professional tailor. And that didn't put you very high up on the social ladder at the time in the 1890s. He's the person, and Peter Broughton has talked about this. Andrew Elvins is a person, I think, who can be most credited with keeping the RASC alive during that shadowy period. He used a 3-inch refractor, and there's a picture of it there, on an alt-azimuth mount. And he wasn't very tall, so I guess it wasn't hard to get it high enough for him to use. And at later oppositions, he used Miller's 4-inch, he used Alan Lumsden's 10-inch reflector, and he even used the professional 6-inch refractor of the Toronto Magnetic and Meteorological Observatory. But for this 1882 opposition, I think he was mostly using his own 3-inch reflector. What's interesting, again, these are watercolors. And if you look at them closely, you can see that the preliminary sketching was done with a pencil. So we have a bunch of his which are undated. So these can be from any opposition during his lifetime. And my favorite of these are the ones which are just in pencil in the upper right. They're my favorite because I think they're most artistically accomplished. I will say that the one in the middle there in the bottom row reminds me of what you see if Mars is low on the horizon and you've got to look through a lot of the Earth's atmosphere. 1918, Alan Miller publishes that paper I mentioned, and these are 3 of the drawings which he published. Here's a key to the surface markings, the albedo markings he could discern. He was able to see quite a lot. Again, the media of this looks like it was. We have stuff by another member from that very same period, Henry Westerby. Some of you familiar with the incidents around World War I in Canada may be familiar with his name. I'll get to that in a minute. So these are 3 drawings. They're pencil drawings. They're published in RASC, so Journal of the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada. He used a 6-inch refractor, and that was quite a large refractor for that time. I mean, it's still a considerable instrument now. There's the instrument he probably used. It belonged to the Guelph Center, and that's Asbury, who apparently took the instrument to Montreal and he joined the Montreal Center. I might as well mention, so Westerby became quite notorious in Canada and in Canadian history. He was a local recruiter for the militia during World War I in Guelph. He didn't like the idea that some Catholics appeared to be shirking their duty. And he was one of the actors, one of the people responsible for a raid of a Jesuit seminary, because he interpreted the Canadian rules as not exempting those people, which caused a bit of a scandal. But as far as I know, that didn't affect his astronomy. 1958, we have drawings by only one person, Zielinski. I have no other information about him. I am assuming that he was a member of the Quebec Center. He spoke at one of our early General Assemblies, all about Mars. He observed the 10-inch f7.2 reflector, which at the time was a bit short for a planetary reflector, and used power of 150, and he talks about the seeing. For the most part, the seeing was pretty good. And these are the surviving drawings of his that we have there in pencil. He was pretty good, actually. 1960, I don't know if Klaus Brasch is with us tonight, but he's a surviving member of Montreal Center, was part of the observing team involved with this really interesting project. This is the first and most notable example of a RASC team effort, and what I should probably have written is probably the only example of a RASC team effort involving a cadre of people doing planetary imaging and mapping. It's the sort of thing that the British Astronomical Association does regularly, and has done since 1890. It's the sort of thing that a lot of the Japanese amateur groups do, and of course the Association of Lunar and Planetary Observers. The Mars section of this is led by Jeff. He wasn't a doctor at that time. He was just finishing his first degree, his BA. And as Jeff remarked, this was a term project for a course in cartography, and he thought he might as well do celestial cartography. So he's taking that at McGill. And they convinced Klaus and Konstantin Papakosmos and a bunch of other people to take part in this. Now, at that time, the Montreal Center had a really, really solid, a really good tradition of observing. A bunch of people observing to good intent. And I think they may have reached a level which no other center reached, both for length of time this went on and for what was accomplished. I haven't counted them. In the archives, we've got 3 books, one devoted to Jupiter, one devoted to Venus, and one devoted to Mars, which have got hundreds of drawings by this team in Montreal. They even invited some of the public to try their hand with this. The main instrument they used was that 6-inch refractor. You see a picture of it there, but also an 8-inch reflector, which brought into service. And this is one of Klaus's drawings. Klaus, he's now known as a really good astrophotographer. At the time, all those years ago, he was known as a good astro sketcher. I don't know if Klaus still sketches. That's one of his drawings. And actually, if you saw that drawing in real life, it's actually much more subtle and much more skillful than in this reproduction of it. It's digitization. And he's using quite high power on the reflector, so I guess the seeing was good. This is in downtown Montreal. The good old days. Here's some close-ups. This is one of Andrew Elvin's. This is Andrew Elvin's best surviving one from 1892. And you can see the effect of the watercolor. What you might not be able to make out here, and this was common in the 1890s, this was done on a round blank, cut the size. So you do the drawing on it, and then you paste it in the album. And on some of these, you can actually see glue markings. They're actually glue marks, which sort of escape from underneath the drawing of Mars. They're usually very neat, so you can't see any glue marks here. But that strikes me as a crazy extra step in doing this sort of astronomical scrapbooking. Why wouldn't you do it on a whole preserved form? But in order to get that black background, they often thought the best way was to use a sheet that was dyed black and then cut out your drawing and paste it on. And there's one of these drawings in the archive. I'm not showing it tonight, but it's online. It shows an occultation of Saturn by the moon. It's a really small drawing, and they did this. They did this incredibly delicate cutting out. I mean, the rings of Saturn and the space between, I think even the space between Saturn, so the space between the ring and the planet, cut out. And they did it really skillfully. But again, it seems like a tremendously difficult extra step you're putting in there. I believe it looks like a Syrtis Meyer, but I may be wrong. And I think the South Polar Cap. But this is quite a good drawing. Watercolor is difficult to do. The other thing I should say about all of these that we're looking at, the question you should ask yourself when you're looking at these things is, are these surviving drawings, are they first generation observational drawings? Are these the things, the records that were actually done at the eyepiece? And I can tell you that if you see color on them, probably not. I think most of the advice we have of people in the 19th century doing drawings at the eyepiece, because you're using dim light, your color receptors aren't as sensitive. And most of the drawings were probably done just with pencil, just different shades of pencil. Your memory of what you saw at the eyepiece was still good. It was often still, people report on this, still good the morning after. You got daylight, then you can do a copy or you can add the color then, which I think what a lot of people did. So these are second generation drawings probably, where the color was added the day after or when they went in that night, or perhaps so using an oil lamp. 1918, these are two close-ups of those we saw. The one on the left is Miller, is 4-inch one, and the one on the right is one done by Westerby using a 6-inch. 1918. What do you notice with these? You notice earlier, you don't see them. Even though by 1892, that was almost 2 decades after Schiaparelli published his canal findings. And even earlier, you can see things which look like canals in Mars drawings by people like Reverend Dawes in the 1860s, I think, perhaps even the 1850s. Many of them, and they're not that straight. So this is interesting. 1890s, members of the RASC are following what's really the British tradition. So people like, what's his name? Green, Nathaniel Green. He was a watercolorist to Queen Victoria, but he's also an astronomical, an astro sketcher. Of course, you can imagine he had a really good technique. He was a professional watercolorist. He didn't draw canals, and he thought that, I believe he was an anti-canalist. And so 1890s, that's what people like Elvin's, it's the category they fall into. They're not seeing the canals. By 1918, RASC members are. Which is sort of interesting, that time delay. 1958, this is Zielinski, no canals. That doesn't mean canals were not still in the atmosphere, in the air, as it were. The whole canal thing wasn't really, I mean, people look at Antoniadi's 1909 campaign with the great refractor at Meudon, outside Paris, as blowing away the canals, or Edward Monder's experiments to show that the canals were actually an optical artifact of not getting enough resolution. But despite those published examples, the idea of the canal still had huge cultural weight. And they weren't blown away until Mariner 4, sending back those photographs. And even Carl Sagan was shocked to see that actually the basis for the canals was just an optical artifact. So Zielinski didn't draw them, which is really interesting. I think he was quite a skilled observational artist. Now, looking at this, there's something else we can see here. If you look right at the center of Mars, you see a marking, the pencil marking, two circular markings there. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but it's right. I'm going to put it over the markings right now. Those are not a depiction of what Zielinski saw on Mars. What those are, and this shows us that he didn't use prepared form when he sketched at the eyepiece. And these, I suspect, are his eyepiece sketches because they're done in pencil, no color. That's the marking of one of the feet of a compass for drawing a circle. So what he did, and I've occasionally done this, I'm sure some of the people listening have done this. You want to prepare a round blank for drawing, you draw it with a compass. And one of the things that gets left in the compass, that gets left in what you're going to draw on, is that hole there. That's actually a hole in the paper. And then when you draw over it, when you do your planetary drawing, it gets filled in, and you get that characteristic round mark when it gets filled in with lead. So that gives us a bit of a clue there about how he went about it. I can't quite tell, looking at these, whether he used a stub. So that's sort of a hard rolled up piece of paper that you use for smoothing out and distributing the lead once you put it down. It's part of standard artistic practice. You can use your finger for that, and you don't have to use it at all if you don't think it's necessary. 1960. So this is that project that Jeff Garrity was the principal investigator, to use a term that's common now but wasn't used at the time, to map Mars. And this is one of Klaus's observational drawings. And this is the actual drawing that Klaus did at the eyepiece on that night. And you can see he's using a form. And this is what a lot of us do now. He has all the details of observation. And on the right there is a blown up version of Klaus's image. And I think he was pretty damn good at this. So he gives the central meridian, he gives the time, universal time, and the power he's using and the seeing and stuff like that. So I think he gives the central meridian. I haven't got my glasses on, so I can't quite read it. This is the map. And you see Jeff assigned it on the bottom right there. So Jeff took the best of the observations from this album in 1960, 1961, and put together this map, which is really cool. So it's a map of all of Mars that they could see back then based on those observations in 1960, 1961. I don't know if Jeff got a good mark in his class, but at McGill, but I assume he did. And what you see are things we'd interpret as canals there. And I think it was Walter McDonald, who asked Jeff, it was either me or Walter, or it could have been both of us, asked Jeff and Klaus for any comments they had, reminiscing back about their days doing this, particularly about the canals. And it was really interesting what they sent back. They said, well, if I can recall this, and this is on the RASC website, you can actually find this now, both this image and the comments, that they drew the canals in because people were still drawing them. So there's people at the Lowell Observatory. And even the American Air Force did an aerographic map, aerographic map, so a map of Mars, I think it was 1958, which was pretty heavy. It was meant for scientific purposes, but it was still heavy with canals. So this is still canals in official planetary science publications. What Jeff said is that they drew these things in even though they had great doubts about them, which is really interesting. I mean, it's as if, it's the way that, so you're doing something, you're following a discipline, you're following a particular scientific practice, It's what the discipline does. And even if you have doubts about it, because everyone around you is doing it, you tend to follow it. It's a formality of practice. And all of us do this in our various disciplines. It's just one of those things. It doesn't mean that there aren't doubts about it or that it won't be thrown over by the next is one of Kuhn's ideas, paradigms that comes along, but it doesn't mean you've got total, just because you're using the practice doesn't mean you have total faith in it. And that's what Jeff remembers about their attitude towards this. I don't know if any of the observers now in the RASC Astro Sketch group are going to try to do a map. I think Chris has got enough drawings that he actually could, and I think some of the others do. And it'd be nice if you guys could do that. I suppose the other thing you could do like a map is you could do a animation. Come to think of it, I guess when COVID lifts, Walter and I could actually do an animation with those drawings from the Montreal Center in 1960, 1961. I suppose we could do that. So, come to my last slide. Talking about RASC members, there were other people associated with the RASC and who were RASC members who had much bigger footprint in the world of astronomy than the people I've been talking about. And here's a caricature of some of them. There are two camps. On the left, you've got canalists, and on the right, you've got anti-canalists. You can even see this in the two versions of Mars that they're holding. So on the left, there's Percival Lowell, Camille Flammarion, and Giovanni Schiaparelli. So these are three of the prominent canalists. When I drew this, I should have included W.H. Pickering, but I didn't. And on the right, we've got Eugène Michel Antoniadi, one of the greatest visual observers of all time, fantastic observational artist. And the version of Mars globe he's holding is actually one of his drawings. Right next to him is Walter Monder. He's one of the highly played. I think he may have been eventually first assistant at Greenwich or just under that. Did some solar physics. The Monder minimum is named after him, but he was also involved with this is around 1900, the whole issue of what you could see about Mars and what you could see on Mars and what you couldn't see on Mars. Now, Monder was an honorary member of the RASC. Flammarion was an honorary member of the RASC, and they were early honorary members of the RASC. And even Percival Lowell, for about a year or less than a year, so it was right before he died, was elected an honorary member of the RASC. Antoniadi wasn't. I wish he had been, but he published. So he deigned to publish in JRASC, which I think is really cool. So all these people and their theories, so these are people all on the cutting edge of whether the canals are real and the nature of the canals and what they said about observational science and what they said about physical astronomy and the whole question of plurality of worlds, life in other worlds, intelligent life in other worlds. All those cutting edge theories were part and parcel of the atmosphere in which the less prominent members of the RASC who did planetary observing, or even the armchair ones, they were aware of this stuff and probably took pride as they took sides, as they took their own personal sides between canalists and anti-canalists. And that's the end of my presentation. So what I'm going to do is stop share. There we go. Chris, you can unmute yourself. And I can go back to any of those images, by the way.
That was amazing, Randall.
The one thing I should say,
I loved it.
And what I didn't show, and it bugs me when I didn't show it, is that I've got here some digitalizations. I've got the whole series of digitalizations of the reports of the British Astronomical Association. So they were issuing Mars reports in the 1890s. They're comprehensive, they're detailed, and they're full of drawings. And they have a tradition which puts the RASC to shame. And I don't know. Sorry, good point, Nick. I'm just going to ask the next question, which everyone can see. That's Cerulli. He was a really interesting, came from a very wealthy family. I think they were Tuscan, I'm not sure. So he's a short guy on the right. So Cerulli, and he's one of the anti-canalists. He was a very good controversialist. He owned his own private observatory. He had an 8-inch refractor, which he later gave to one of the Italian institutions. And I think that his instrument is still in service, which is sort of cool. Anyway, so go back to the BAA. So at the early years, 1890s, the RASC tried to institute these observing sections. British Astronomical Association has these observing sections. They're still going. Now, occasionally they hit shoals and rocky territory. It depends on who you have in the society who is in the position of leadership, and whether you've got a bunch of people around who can do mentoring, who are themselves skilled. If you've got enough people to do that, it can be a going concern. Anyways, and yes, Peter's right. Yes, Peter, that is Asbury with the Guelph instrument. So Peter Broughton's question is exactly right. And I think, Peter, you've got that book, you've got that image in your book, looking up. So getting back to what I was mumbling about, why the RASC couldn't maintain the effort nationally to have a tradition of critical observing that matters is something that escapes me. I cannot figure it out. And I don't think anyone's ever really looked at this in a concentrated way. I'm sure Peter's thought about it. I'm sure other people have thought about it. I just don't know why. Now, it's possible that people interested in planetary observing join the BAA or join the Association of Lunar and Planetary Observers in the States, or those interested in variable star work. Why? Of course, you're going to join the American Association of Variable Star Observers. That still, to me, doesn't explain the RASC's failure. And it's a failure which goes on to this present day. And there were moments when the RASC could have broke through. One was the International Geophysical Year, I think 56, 57. There's a lot of organized activity, and the professionals and the RASC, people like Peter Millman, were pushing the amateurs to get involved. So it was a real pro-am thing. And a lot of advanced amateurs in the society were doing good work. But it just didn't last. Anyways, I don't understand the failure. Anyway, sorry, Chris, I'll shut up now.
Not at all, Randall. I was just, all I was saying before is I really, really loved the presentation, and I think a lot of people did as well. We have a few hands up though. Shall we take some questions? I can see
I think,
Klaus is, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think Klaus had his hand up when his name was mentioned earlier in the...
Oh, Klaus is here. Cool. Actually, can Klaus, can you unmute?
I'll allow him to
Klaus?
talk if he wants to.
Yeah, cool. Because I want to hear, forget about what I'm saying. I want to hear what Klaus has to say about that activity.
Excuse me, go ahead.
Terrific.
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, great. Nice to see you guys, and I'm very happy that you're doing this sort of thing, because it's certainly with the pandemic, it's one way to stay in touch. And Randall, you did a superb job, and I am delighted to see that the good old Montreal Center is being featured. Let me just make a couple of comments and observations, if that's okay. Number one, I think one of the reasons the Montreal, when I first joined the RASC in 1950, well, the Stone Age, I was in Toronto, and the Toronto Center was the biggest in the country, and it was overwhelmingly big, actually. So it was very hard, actually, to sit down with people, except if you belong to the observing group or the telescope making group and so on. And that's where I first met Terence Dickinson, and we made friendships that's lasted to this day. But then in '58, my family moved to Montreal, and I joined the Montreal Center. And from day one, they were beautifully organized, thanks to people like Isabel Williamson and Charles Good and others, who immediately took any novice under their wings and pointed them to things that they might be interested in doing. And one of the programs that Jeff called me before I even met him, Jeff Garrity, and invited me to join what was then considered really an avant-garde type of thing of looking for lunar meteors. The idea there was that if you looked at the very thin crescent, past the very thin crescent of the new moon or the old moon, looked at the dark unilluminated side of the moon, you might be able to see a meteor crashing, to see a flashpoint or something like that. And that was actually sponsored by the ALPO, the Association of Lunar and Planetary Observers. But in addition to that, the Montreal Center had active programs in lunar crater observations, in planetary observations, in meteor watching, in nova searches, in variable star work, in all kinds of things. And whatever tickled your fancy, you would join up. The other thing that the Montreal Center had that I don't think any other center in Canada had at the time was their own very nice observatory on the McGill University campus. You can see it in the archives, a picture of it. And it was a building that had been used during World War II by the McGill physics people working with Doppler radar. And after the war, they no longer needed it. So here was in a fairly dark corner of the campus was this building that was basically leased to the Montreal Center, sort of, 99 years for $1 kind of thing. And they put a dome on it and installed the 6-inch refractor. They had a central sort of ground floor that served as lecture hall and library, and then the basement served for telescope making and other things like that. So everybody joined something or other very quickly because you then felt part of the group. And believe it or not, we met every Saturday of the year except for holidays. And the really keeners, like Jeffrey and myself and George Wedge and Kenneth Chalk, and Konstantin Papakosmas, we would actually show up Wednesday nights because that was observing night if it was clear. So it was teamwork, it was a bit of competition, and it was an awful lot of fun. Plus, the skies were still reasonably dark at that time over Montreal before all the skyscrapers came up. So we could actually do some messy hunting and other things like that. So I think that kind of made the Montreal Center rather unique. And in addition, several members belonged to the BAA as well as ALPO. And in 1962, we actually hosted the first ALPO convention outside of the United States. And it was very well attended and it was incredibly active. And we probably had 300 or 400 people attending from the US and from other provinces, etc. It was a lot of fun. And that set a lot of us, myself included, who were all college students at the time, helped set us on a career in science. I never became an astronomer, mostly because, well, math wasn't my strong suit. I love fossils, so I decided to go into biology. And that's what I ended up being. Eventually went on to graduate school, get my PhD in cellular biology. But I always kept my interest in astronomy all along, largely because of those initial times in the Montreal Center where Isabel Williamson and Charles Good and others simply were wonderful mentors and guided us all the way. And they were just ordinary working class people who were incredibly knowledgeable about astronomy and incredibly passionate about it. I think that explains a lot why that stayed. And as long as Isabel and Charles and others of their age group were in charge, things kept humming for a number of years. And of course, then they retired and eventually passed away. With respect to the Mars sketches and the canals that showed up on our sketches and drawings, two things I want to mention. Number one, many of those are actually, and we were convinced there were no canals there, but what they are is probably contrast areas between lighter portions of the desert, Martian desert, and darker portions. And in fact, many of the larger, quotes, canals that all the canalists observed so keenly are actually real features. For example, there's the area on Mars called Solus Lacus, at least that's what it was called then, and it was, or the Eye of Mars. And if you looked at the bottom and top of this eye, there were faint lines going back and forth. The bottom line, or the northernmost line, is actually Valles Marineris, that nobody realized what it was before, of course, the flybys and so on. But it's now easily photographed even in amateur instruments because the technology has moved forward. And there were several other structures like that, which are large-scale Martian structures. Now, people who weren't convinced they were canals, including most of us, simply saw them as wide, fuzzy, hard to resolve images. And basically that's what Antoniadi claimed in, when he had the Meudon refractor in Paris and got into these big battles with Lowell and the other canalists. In fact, I think there was kind of a culture of canalism at the turn of the 20th century. And if any of you are interested in following that up a little more, I published an article in Sky and Telescope about 2 years ago called Canal Mania. And it'll give you some of the historical and the technical background, why it was easy to convince people that they were canals on Mars and that they were possibly built by intelligent beings to be able to tap polar water to the warmer equatorial regions of Mars, and that this was a dying civilization and all of that. And that's basically what Percival Lowell, of course, believed and fostered. But so did Schiaparelli. Never believed they were artificial, but many of the other contemporaries of his, including Flammarion in France, really pushed that idea. And if you look through some of the old issues, and they're all here in the Lowell Observatory archives, of the old issues of journals from those days, people all over the world were seeing double canals and attending to the names. And, oh yeah, I finally saw, Ganges being double, etc. That was pure nonsense, but they had convinced themselves that these were canals. And my friend and colleague, who some of you may have read his books, William Sheehan, who is a renowned astronomical historian, especially solar system historian, he's also a psychiatrist. And he pointed out, for example, that what Lowell would do with his beautiful 24-inch Clark refractor, because Mars was so dazzlingly bright, would often close, he had a diaphragm at the open end of the objective, and he would close it down, often as little as down to as much as 6 inches in aperture, because that cut down on chromatic aberration and glare. And as a result, he would basically have built what Bill Sheehan considers an ophthalmoscope. So he was seeing a reflection of his own retinal blood vessels, because this pattern of canals on Mars also often appears on Saturn, Jupiter, and Venus in his drawings. So, Lowell he was an odd character. He had great vision, not physical vision, but vision in what he wanted to do and so on. And he certainly founded this wonderful observatory. But in terms of his sort of, he was a snob, he was a Brahmin, a very wealthy person from the Boston elite in those days. And, you know, he was an exceptionally good mathematician, taught at Harvard. And so when he spoke, people listened because he had great authority, and he went around the world touting these stories. So there's a lot to that canal culture of the day. But still, when you look at Mars today on a very good seeing with a decent sized telescope, and for example, if you use filters like red filters to enhance the contrast of the albedo features, you will often see areas that are brighter and darker to the eye. And that's simply a difference in terms of the wind-strewn darkness and brightness of the Martian sands in many instances. So anyway, that's my little bit. And thank you, Randall. That's just a wonderful presentation. I'm going to be writing, as I promised to Randall, a retrospective. I'm putting it together now, retrospective on the heydays of the Montreal Center. And I'll be mentioning a lot of these things in more detail as to why it was such probably one of the best astronomy clubs in North America at the time, and about as close to many of the BAA sections that the British managed to put together. So anyway, thank you. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Just out of curiosity, it hadn't occurred to me, you mentioned filters, the simple color filters that people use. When did they start to be used on Mars? Do you have any idea?
Actually, quite early on. There's one of the, Lowell wasn't the greatest astronomer, but the people he hired were exceptional. One of them was Carl Lampland. The other two were the Slipher brothers, Vesto and E.C. Slipher. Lampland was a tinkerer with all kinds of instrumentation, and he took some of the best early photographs around the turn of the 1906 or 8, I forget the exact year, using the Clark refractor and using color filters to try to enhance different portions of what he was looking at, number one. And number two, the early film emulsions that were being used in those days were incredibly slow and also incredibly insensitive to red light. They were mostly sensitive to blue light. And so he was trying to enhance, that portion of the spectrum doing his photography. A few years later, E.C. Slipher, Earl Slipher, the brother of Vesto, he began experimenting with better emulsions that were then available that were more red sensitive. And they started using filters all the time to enhance either cloud patterns or atmospheric patterns or surface patterns. For example, if you look at Mars through a violet or deep blue filter, it cuts down on the glare, but you won't see any surface detail. But what you will see is the polar cap, the polar hood, and some of the clouds, because only light from the upper atmosphere actually is recorded then by the eye. If you use a deep red filter, often that also helps steady the seeing, because red is a longer wavelength that's not as affected by turbulence as much as green light is, for example, which is what our eyes are sensitive to. So if you have a set of filters, RGB filters, by all means, try them out on different planets. It's really fun. One final note on what E.C. Slipher did, and he was a believer in the canals. He tried forever to get convincing photographs. And he published a couple of magnificent books. And he was one of the pioneers that actually tried image stacking, because the films in those days were so grainy that you could really never record what you could see with the naked eye through the same telescope. But what he did was called integration printing, and I wrote an article about that a few years ago in the Sky and Telescope as well. where what he would do is he would take several rapid exposures of any planet, so say Mars again, in rapid succession on the same plate. And then when he made prints of those, he built this apparatus where he could gradually build up the image using the different negatives of the planet that he had taken. He built this little mechanical construction, so all you had to do was move the plate over and flash light through it, and you could combine 10, 15 different images taken at roughly the same time. And in the process, you would enhance contrast and also reduce graininess. And of course, that's what, digital image stacking does today, only of course much easier and much better. But he had a notion to doing that even in those days. And Vestos Slifer, the older brother, who became a very famous astronomer, he actually first used spectroscopy on spiral nebulae, because Lowell was convinced. Remember, spiral nebulae in those days, we didn't realize spiral nebulae were other galaxies. Nobody knew that. Everybody thought what we see as the Milky Way is the whole universe. And Lowell was convinced that the spiral nebulae, as they were called, were actually young solar systems in the making, thinking there was gas that was being trapped into a spiral and would eventually condense into planets. So in order to study the chemical makeup of those things, he had one of the very first spectrographs ever made. It must have cost a fortune in its day, and it's still on display here at Lowell. It's a magnificent piece of work. And Vestos Slifer then started taking spectra of these spiral nebulae. And believe it or not, he would have to take, because the emulsions in those days were so slow and the spectra were very faint, he would spend sometimes 7, 8, or to record the spectrum of one nebula because it was so faint. And then what he did is he measured from the spectrum with control spectra of, say, calcium light or so on. He could measure the recession velocity, the radial velocity of these nebulae. And he soon realized that one of the first ones he did was look at the Andromeda galaxy, because it's one of the brightest. And he realized from his spectra that it was blue shifted. In other words, it was moving towards us. When he looked at some of the other fainter ones, he realized they were red shifted, indicating they were moving away from us. And some of them were receding at speeds of 300, 400, and 500 kilometers per second. So he soon did a calculation and realized these things cannot be in our Milky Way. They have to be way outside. But he didn't know what to make of that. So in 1914, he attended a meeting of the American Astronomical Society and gave his talk showing the various spectra and the radial velocity of these various nebulae that he had taken images of, and basically showed that the fainter and further they were, the faster they were receding from us. And Edwin Hubble was in the audience at that time. And Slifer got a standing ovation. This had never been done before. And Hubble then went back to California, where he had access first to the 60-inch reflector, which was much more powerful and light gathering, so he could take spectra at a much faster, higher resolution than Slifer could with the 24-inch Clark. And as we all know, a few years later, he showed using the 100-inch telescope that not only were these things receding from us at enormous speeds, but that he was able to resolve Cepheid variables in the Andromeda galaxy, and from that determine its absolute distance, and then added that to recession the other galaxies that he observed, and he realized that the universe was expanding. But this entire work was pioneered at Lowell Observatory by Vesto Slifer. Anyway, I think we've gone far from canals, but
Thanks, Klaus. That stuff, particularly about the Montreal Center. I mean, it was all interesting, but that stuff about the Montreal Center was invaluable.
no argument from me.
Well, no, and for me, it's the high point of tonight. Anyways,
Yeah, it is. Well, I think your talk is the high point. I really.
We'll argue about this later.
No, yeah, it's wonderful how deeply you've gotten into all of this, and I loved your interpretations, especially of the early work, of how people did color, etc., using very small telescopes, but they had keen eyes and were very, very particular and detailed about it. So kudos to you. Are you going to write all of that up?
I hadn't planned to.
Well, you should.
Not in this.
I'll assign you homework. How about that?
I see.
Well, I recorded it, so hopefully.
Oh, good.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Klaus. I see Mark and Franklin had their hands up. I'm going to assume they'll want to talk, so I'll mute you and unmute them. How do I do this?
There we go. Hi, Randall. That was really thoroughly enjoyable. Thanks so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yep. So it's Mark Tovey. You were mentioning, Randall, that Monder had done something like experiments, something like perceptual experiments showing how canal-like lines could be perceived by observers. Do you, are you able to elaborate on that a little bit, or do you have any pointers on where I might be able to read more?
Yeah, I have to, well, they're in Bill Sheehan's book,
Okay.
the one published by University of Arizona Press, 1992, I think. Actually, it's online. I think the press has put the whole damn thing online.
Fantastic.
Bill's got details on there, but also the actual paper itself. But there are various places Monder reported on it. What he did is he got, it may have been boys at the Blue Coat School, associated with near Greenwich, near the Greenwich Observatory. So what he did is he set up, he constructed some drawings and then had them, well, what they were, I believe there were lines, look like canals, but they were dots closely spaced, and how far back you put them would determine whether you saw them as a series of discrete lines or a series of discrete dots, whether you could resolve them, or as lines, I believe. And he ran these experiments. By the way, Arthur C. Clarke also ran the experiment decades later, just because he was interested. Flammarion claimed to run a similar experiment and come up with exact opposite so-called proofs. But I'd have to send you, I'll send you the information after this, because I can't quite recall it in proper detail. But I'm pretty sure that the paper, that the publication Monder did, it may have been in one of the publications of the Royal Astronomical Society or the JBAA. The Journal of British Astronomical Association. I can't quite remember.
Okay.
If it's in any of those sources, they'd be freely available through the NASA ADS
All right.
server.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Randall.
And actually, if people were looking for an activity, so next time an opposition to Mars comes along, I suppose, and if you're going to be faced with questionable weather, I suppose one possibility as an indoor activity would be to, just for the audience who shows up, you could rerun that experiment.
So
It might be sort of fun.
Okay, I'm going to see if Franklin has something to say. He's got his hand up. You should be good.
Okay.
Go ahead.
You've muted Franklin, unless he muted himself. Franklin, you can unmute yourself.
Hang on, I'll see.
I'm trying to.
There we
There
go.
you are.
I might have muted.
You can hear me now?
Yes.
This is the first webinar I've seen. I haven't seen, actually. I can only see two of you and have no idea how many people are on here. So it's a little strange. But Randall, thank you very much for that talk and that early history. It's really interesting. We can compare the optics of the telescopes then with today and the technology, and it just blows people away today, what you can see and what you can photograph and draw and so on. But you caused a real flood of memories about the early RASC in the 50s and 60s. I joined in 1952. I think I was in junior high at the time, and through the Edmonton Center. And I will have to say that the influence of the Montreal Center and its observing program was extremely important. Isabel Williamson ran a pretty tight ship and was very disciplined and so on. And one of the things that was produced in the Montreal Center was Dr. Earl Milton, who came out as an early high school student to the Edmonton Center, and he organized us into observing disciplines, and we started observing big time at that particular point, and collected quite a few documents and so on, which have ended up in various places like the Provincial Museum, or the Provincial Archives, and one person that was extremely important who came from Wetaskiwin, Dennis Fell. His thousands, literally thousands of drawings of Mars and Jupiter, Saturn, and so on have ended up in the National Archives in Ottawa. So they're everywhere. Unfortunately, they didn't end up in the RASC. But nevertheless, it's important to know exactly where these things are, and perhaps the various centers can inform the national office where much of the material is to be found. So most of this material is going to appear via the internet, and access to the documents will still be possible, but I'm sure that they are spread all over the place. One of the particular drawings I thought was I enjoyed was the Mercator projection of the Martian landscape spread out onto a single frame. And I'm reminded of the something that was interesting. The Calgary Center, I don't think it even existed at the time. Anyway, there were two of us, Ian McLennan, myself, and so on. We wrote an article for the Calgary newspaper at the time, the big one, the Calgary Albertan. And believe it or not, a panorama very similar to what you showed tonight appeared on the front page, I might add, of the Calgary Albertan. So I'm not too sure how many people across the country have been able to get front page treatment of observing programs from the various centers and so on. But I produced a composite of the various features that the members of the Edmonton Center were able to see during an opposition in the middle of the 1950s and so on, and they were there. So thank you again, Randall, for reminding us that it's important that we retain our history. And you've been doing a good job, and I wish you had existed 50 years ago and set everything up so we would be doing the right thing today.
It's good of you to say that, Franklin. I did exist 50 years ago, but not in a form that would have been useful. We're not old enough to be useful for this. Franklin, do you still have a copy of that composite image you did?
Well, I had to downsize from a house to an apartment in Edmonton, then coming down to Charlotte to be close to my son. Unfortunately, all of these things had to disappear into the archives of various sorts. So I don't have it in my possession. It's with the provincial archives right now. And we're talking about the observations of the sun, for instance, during the giant 1957-8 solar maximum, and 10 years of observations of that. And there are a lot of other things that were of interest, including Comet Aaron Roland, which I managed to inform Sky and Telescope many years ago, that appeared with the secondary tail, the ion tail, and so on. And I managed to get a sequence of about 4 or 5 drawings showing the movement as the comet changes orientation relative to the Earth. And they have it as well. So most of this is in the Alberta Provincial Archives in Edmonton. I don't know how much of it is available yet, but I know they are cataloging the information.
This is true. I mean, the principal thing is to get the stuff put in archives and have it preserved. Okay, I'm sorry it's not the RASC archives, but still it's preserved. I have a question about that great sunspot. I think it was 57, I think. Were you able, now using proper, did you ever try looking at it through welder's glass at the time? The reason I'm asking this has come up with a much earlier observation. The question, if you have a great sunspot and you protect your eyes properly, but are not using, or just using, so naked eye observation, but you protected your eye, can you actually see a penumbra in a great sunspot? Do you have any memory of that?
Well, okay. Years ago, when I did my solar observations for the solar division of the AASO, I was reporting rather extraordinary numbers in for sunspots, and they didn't understand why, because they were used to perfectly sane people taking all the necessary precautions to observe the sun with safety in mind. I was too naive at the time, and so as a result, what I was doing was observing the sun directly through the telescope with one of the welder's glasses in front of the eyepiece, can you imagine? But moving it very quickly so that there wasn't any particular spot that got too hot and caused it to break and then stab me in the eye. So we were able to explain the extraordinary numbers that I was able to produce for the AASO by the fact that I didn't use a projection method to actually get the sunspots.
You're less cautious in your youth.
And I can still see out of that eye, the welder's glass, even at a temperature of minus 30 degrees in the surrounding air, and the temperature from a 6-inch telescope and so on, I only broke the glass only once. So I didn't have a chance to really sear my eye out.
Don't try this at home.
Yes, I would agree, unless you have a very quick hand so that you can distribute the heat over the much of the area of the welder's glass.
Thank you, Franklin.
I think we have a question there from Eric.
Okay.
Do you want me to read it, Clark? I got it here.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. I thought you wanted to talk. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, if Eric wants to talk, that's fine too. But he was asking if most observers tend to keep their logbooks private on a bookshelf on their home. How can the RASC archive these significant observations that its members make throughout the years. For example, are the sketches from the RASC Astro Sketching email list archived somewhere beyond people's inboxes? That's a good
Not as far
question.
as I know.
I know that sometimes, I think what you as well as Walter have kindly done, though, is to create web pages based on significant events. But I think that the email lists, and Walter could correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that they are archived somewhere. I used to be able to go in, I haven't done this in a number of years, but when I first joined the RASC, I would go in and sort of browse the email archive and read the emails from some of the more experienced members to glean some of their knowledge. But maybe Walter can better answer that than we can.
What I will say is Walter deserves all the credit for preserving the so those records of observational sketches for particular things like transit of Venus. I think that was mostly Walter. I think.
Yeah, I know he's been quite involved. So
he's responded. He thinks there's an archive on the St. Mary's server.
Yeah. But that server is going away soon. We need to
Apparently.
archive. We need to archive the archive.
And so do I want that server in the archive?
Randall, I had a couple of things I wanted to bring up. By the way, our meeting's scheduled to end at 10. That doesn't mean we're going to get thrown out, is it? It's just because I set it to end at 10, but I assume that we can carry on if we need to.
Phil says that
Okay.
the database is being backed on an AWS server weekly.
Yeah, AWS is the Amazon Web Services. It's a cloud system from Amazon Corporation.
Now I've sent everybody a link, and I hope it works. And this is it's a article or a paper about it's called Drawings of Jupiter's Third Satellite, and it was done in 1897. And if you go to the second page, you'll see what's the third satellite? That's is that Ganymede? It shows lots of sketches of the surface of Ganymede with lines in it.
Good heavens.
Surely that has to be influenced by Lowell. I don't know if you can see it or not. Are you getting it, Chris?
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute there. Yeah, I know. I was just taking a look at it. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, some observers have made observations of the surface of Ganymede. I think out of Florida, Carlos Fernandez using a 9-inch.
Well, this is from 1897.
Yeah.
So that's pretty. That seems suspicious to me.
Well, A.E. Douglas was the person right under Lowell until he was dismissed. And when Douglas did this, I think he was still working at the Lowell Observatory.
That's
so
right.
that would answer your question.
Yeah.
Yeah, Douglas later became an anti-canalist and the discoverer of tree rings. Well, as a dendrochronology, as a dating method. Yeah, interesting. Oh, I think what Klaus said is germane here, and may very well apply to observing detail on the moons of Jupiter.
I think what you're meaning there, Randall, is that you mean that it's probably perhaps a tracing of the blood canals.
Well, that combined with expectation, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, you definitely can see those parts of the eye, like when you are straining and out of focus.
Yeah, but I mean, we're good at noting that we're looking at strainers as floaters and stuff, right? I mean, we trained ourselves to do that.
Yeah.
We'll swear at them, but we won't draw them.
Yeah, they sure are.
I'm curious, this whole thing.
Yeah, it is kind of, those are kind of strange. Yeah.
Yeah.
But how much?
Sorry.
I was going to say how much how many canals was Lowell sketching in?
Oh, for God's sake, I forget the number. I'm not even sure if he had the record. There was a BAA member using something not larger than a 6-inch, and he had a huge number of canals.
Mm.
Also, give me a minute. Leo Brenner, I think that was the chap's name. He was in the Eastern Mediterranean. No, he was in the Mediterranean, or I think he was in Corfu. He married a rich widow, used her money to buy an observatory, buy himself an observatory, and later abandoned her. So a bit of a cad, quite a bit of a cad actually. But he was an incredible canalist, and he had an 8-inch refractor, and we've got one of his rare publications in the archives. I'm sure there are copies of these at the Lowell Observatory. And his drawings are thick of them, thick with them. And people would, Klaus is right, people would announce in short papers, communications, I have discovered another canal, here it is. My God, those roadworks on Mars are so busy.
And before we wrap, I can't help but think that it's not a coincidence that when we get to science fiction, even if you're not a science fiction fan, you know who H.G. Wells is. And War of the Worlds came out, I believe, 1898. And I'm wondering if there's any influence from Lowell and all of that.
I'm pretty sure there would be. I think some literary scholars have looked at this and have been able to draw the connections between the canalists and the War of the Worlds. It fits in culturally beautifully.
Oh, one thing that Bill Weir sent through, and I've seen this before, is that there was like a full, sort of Mercator projection of Mars done. I know Bill contributed. Maybe he did the whole thing using 10 and 12.5-inch instruments back in 2000.
Oh, Bill did one by himself. Excellent.
Yeah. So he posted that link there. It's in his Zen folio. I think if you search for like Bill Weir Zen folio, you'll find it pretty quick. Yeah.
Okay, anything else?
There's one more thing. Chris, for your column in JRASC, are you thinking of taking the Astro Sketchers selection of the Mars drawings and publishing them?
Yeah, I would like to. Yeah, if people are making observations and doing sketches, I'd like to try to get some of those together and work with Nicole on creating a bit of a gallery. I think would be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'm a lurker on the Astro Sketchers, and it just came to life about 6 weeks ago. And there's a lot of people doing outstanding images of Mars and sharing them and sharing their techniques too. It's been quite interesting for those that were not aware of that. So,
Mark's also asking if the chat gets preserved. It ought to. It ought to, Mark. I know when I've recorded these in the past, it does take the chat recording as well, and it sort of puts it on a sidebar. Yep. That's the plan. We'll see if it works.
okay, so this was our first attempt at it, and we got a delay in start, and it's certainly no help from me because I'm new to this Zoom stuff too. So we hope to be doing this on a regular basis. We'll have to figure out. It won't always be Randall. We'll give him a break, and we can spread some of the work around there, and we'll try to come up with another topic. And when we do, we'll certainly let everybody know. I was just briefly, you mentioned Walter Monder, and his wife Annie Monder was also an outstanding solar scientist, and both of them were on it's well known in the history committee, the 1905 King expedition to witness an eclipse in Labrador. And we've got dozens and dozens of outstanding photographs. And both of those people were, I believe, part of the British contingency and tagged along. And so the pictures are outstanding. And that's something also, and that can be explored easily thanks to, I believe, Walter McDonald. That's on our website too.
Yeah, Walter did the digitization.
Yeah.
We've got we've got images from 2 different albums of that very eclipse.
So Anyways, I should thank everyone for coming out. I appreciate you dealing with the delay. And until next time, good night. Thanks, Randall.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thank you, Randall. Thanks, Clark. Thanks for sitting these up.
Yeah, very much.
More in the future.
Okay.